Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky Textbooks, revision guides and practice papers. Everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your SQA exams. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk.
And he said, but Douglas, if I kill you, think of the paperwork if I run you over.
Biodiversity is the term used to describe the millions of different species of animals, plants and microorganisms on Earth. In this lesson, we will be discussing biodiversity and learning about both the components of and the threats to biodiversity. We will hear from a man who was almost killed by Sir David Attenborough and learn how drones can be used to extract DNA from whale snot. To help make the key area more interesting, I will be joined by award-winning wildlife cameraman Doug Allan and Eadin O'Mahony, a scientist currently doing her Masters at St Andrews University. Throughout the lesson, we will be referring to the SQA Higher Biology course specification and getting a wider appreciation of the biodiversity key area.
My name is Doug Allan, and I'm a wildlife and documentary cameraman. And I had the pleasure of coming up to Hindland about 2 or 3 years ago when the school pupils were just heading out to Galapagos for a week. So I gave a talk about what I do and what I did, and they seemed to enjoy that.
I think it was one of the very, very few times I've ever seen our assembly hall still full at 3:10 with no one wanting to go anywhere. From memory, everybody was gathered around you at the end, down at the floor. So I'm going to start off by asking the one question that everybody wants to know. What is David Attenborough really like?
You know, he's a real sod. He's really difficult. You know, a real crabby old git.
A bit like yourself.
I always reply to that question with that, and everybody sits back and says, "No, surely not." And no, absolutely not. He's not like that at all. David is a wonderful guy. You know, what you see, what you think about him is what you get. I've never met anyone as generous with his time when he's talking to people, as generous with his advice. And of course, it was meeting him that got me into the business in the first place. I was working in the Antarctic as a diver and a biologist and doing some stills photography. This was back in 1981. And David and a small film crew came onto our base for just 2 days. And I helped them for those 2 days. And at the end of that time, I remember saying to David, right, how do I do what your camera person is doing? And he explained how the business worked. And basically over the next 2 or 3 years, I worked again in the Antarctic, but this time mixing in some filming, and then used that as a springboard into what I do today. So I owe David a lot, and we get on really well. He's, you know, very friendly, and we have a laugh together and things. And he is a remarkable man, and we're all very lucky to have him around.
Absolutely. And it's high praise indeed when you can talk so warmly about somebody that almost killed you with a skidoo.
Well, that's right, yeah. We were filming up in the Arctic, up in Svalbard, and we were doing a sequence about Arctic foxes. And you need to travel quite a long way on the sea ice looking for Arctic foxes. So we wanted to do a sequence of David driving around with his snow machine. So I got various shots of him and what have you. And then I said, right, I need this shot. I'm going to lie down low in the snow, and I want you, David, to zoom past me, you know, really kick up the snow over the camera lens, stuff like that. Now, David can't actually drive. He doesn't have a driving license, never has, and probably now never will do. So he was pretty confident on the snow machine, but not super confident. And I couldn't get him to drive fast enough or close enough to me as I was lying on the snow. And I said, come on, David, you can do this, you can do this. And he said, but Douglas, if I kill you, think of the paperwork if I run you over. And I said to him, look, that's all right, we can cross that. So
he would probably have had to fill it all out himself.
Well, he sort of he used to work, he was a controller of BBC Two before he went back to filmmaking and started off with Life on Earth and things like that. And so he probably knows the sort of paperwork that goes on when you have an accident. But anyway, he didn't run me over. We got the shot, and here we are.
Excellent. To go back to obviously your sort of first encounter with him and when he gave you that first advice, that then led you to film your first piece of footage, which I think was of an emperor penguin.
Yeah, that's right. I met David, and then I came back to UK, and I was offered the chance to go back to the Antarctic to work again for the British Antarctic Survey. But this time, very different base, no diving, not even very many animals, to be honest. I am down at this place called Halley, and they do a lot of ionospherics at Halley, but they were looking for a base commander to be down there through the winter, and that was the job they offered me. So I said, fine, but I was as interested in the fact that when you were at Halley, the base was about 12 miles from the coast. And on the coast, there were a colony of emperor penguins. And emperor penguins are the biggest penguins, but they're also the ones that breed through the winter. So if you want to get shots of emperors, with their eggs, with their young chicks, what have you, you pretty much have to overwinter in the Antarctic. So that means there's not a lot of footage. But I knew if I bought a camera and went down and had the EMPs on the doorstep, so to speak, I might be able to get something. So I bought a camera, contacted the BBC again, and my letter fell into the hands of a producer who was about to start a series about birds. And he said, OK, when you're down there, see if you can get this, and this. Gave me a list, I went down, shot that list, came back. He offered me the chance to go back down again and film in another part of the Antarctic. And that was it. That was really, the great thing about that is, the hard thing when you're starting as a camera person is to get people in a way to take you seriously or to have good material that you can show them. So by working for that programme, by filming the emperor penguins and then other animals in another part of the Antarctic, when that series came out, I could point to the first half of the very first programme and say, you want to see what I do? This is what I do. And it was just great. It was the best showreel that we call them, the best showreel that any aspiring camera person could have. And so it got me started exactly where I wanted to be, where my strengths were, which was in the Antarctic, in the cold, and even a little bit of underwater in there. So it was a great thing. And it all started with meeting David, a year and a half, a couple of years before. So I was very lucky.
And of course, an incredible piece of fortune to stumble across somebody of the calibre of Sir David Attenborough. But right before that, it was a bit of a journey to even get to that point. And like you said, you didn't just suddenly one day become somebody that could just go and film in somewhere like the Antarctic. You finished up at, I think it was Stirling University, with a degree in biology. Where did you go from there?
If people ask me for advice about my career, then I say that the secret for anyone to, I think, head towards a life that they will find satisfying, exciting, what you've got to do is follow what interests you. And sometimes that's not a straight line. I mean, my first interest was snorkeling, diving, which I got into when I was at school. And it was that led me to marine biology at Stirling. And I like biology because I wasn't all that good at other sciences. There was too much maths and physics. Chemistry, I kind of, you can't see chemistry. So you were dealing with things. Biology, on the other hand, we had a great teacher, a guy called Jim Payton. And he used to take us for rugby as well. And Jim was just a great teacher. And I remember him a lot. And he made the biology super interesting. But biology was also exciting at that point too, because we were, going into the sea and discovering all kinds of things about it. So marine biology was very interesting to me. I went to Stirling to study it because it was a new university and they had an interesting course. And then as I did my degree, I thought to myself, I don't really want to be a scientist, not a hard, hands-on, scientist. That just doesn't quite suit me. What I want to do is to stick with the diving and mix it with some biology, and maybe be a biological assistant on an expedition. So when I graduated, I came away and I managed to persuade some biologists in the Red Sea to let me come out there. So I did some diving out there, and then I ran a dive school in Jersey. And that was where I read an article at one point about divers being used in the Antarctic by the British Antarctic Survey as support divers who helped the marine biologists to carry out their work. And I thought, that's it. That's what I'd love to do. So I applied to the British Antarctic Survey and actually failed the interview, which you believe, the only interview I ever had, and I failed it. I think the reason was because I hadn't fully read up enough about the job. And when they said that the job means being away in the Antarctic for a year and a half, for 2.5 years, I was kind of taken aback. I thought it was just a 1.5 year job. But also the other thing was that I was kind of overqualified for the dive job. It was unusual to find someone with a degree in marine biology wanting to do the diver's job. Anyway, I didn't get it, so I went out to the Red Sea because I had another offer there. And when I was in the Red Sea, I got a message from the British Antarctic Survey saying, look, we've got an unexpected vacancy. We've got a medical issue on the base. We're looking for a diver. Can you come down? So it took me a month. 1 month I was in the Red Sea, and a month later I was in the Antarctic. And that went really well for a year and a half. And then I came back and decided to go down again. And it was the end of that second contract that I met David. And when I said to David, I want to be, a cameraman, I hadn't even picked up a movie camera at that point. But I did know that I could take good stills. And I just felt, talking to David and watching the camera person, how they worked, I thought, I can teach myself to do this. So I did. I looked at films and broke them down and thought about the grammar, so to speak, of filmmaking, and just really, took it on from there.
And that. I guess that's quite a strong message, especially at the moment. We're obviously recording this during the COVID-19 lockdown, when there's young people across Scotland who are obviously not able to go into school, and are remotely learning from home. And by the sounds of it, the biggest learning experience you've had was one that you really took control of yourself, and to some extent sort of self-taught in those kind of core skills.
No, I agree, and I think that I've learned an awful lot from other camera people. I've learned an awful lot from editors, actually. If you want to be a good camera person, you want to sit down next to an editor, because they are the people who actually take your material and work their magic on it. But at the same time, for anything you want to do, the internet is a tool which I never had. I couldn't even, it was difficult for me to look at films that I wanted to see, because there was no such thing as iPlayer. There wasn't even VHS cassettes or DVDs or CDs, nothing like that. In order to look at a film after it had been out on the television, I would have to go down to the BBC and persuade someone to get the original film out of the archives, and I'd sit down in front of a machine and actually play it back and forward. So I think, today the internet is a phenomenal tool. You can discover so much about whatever you want to find out by going to the internet. Just don't look at just one site, however, that tells you so-and-so. Look at lots of different sites, because, you'll pick up different things from every site. And if every site does tell you or lay emphasis on the same things, then you can be sure that that thing is really important. But certainly for photography and for a lot of aspects of learning, I don't think you should stop going to school. But there's no doubt that the
Absolutely
internet,
not.
But the internet, you've got to keep following a job, for example. But there's no doubt that the internet and online editing, online tutorials and things are a phenomenal way to learn about things. It's remarkable how everything from fixing a plumbing fitting under your sink to rewiring a plug to knowing how to service your lawnmower, how to take a better photograph, how to write better English in an essay. all the tools are there, and often expressed in a really imaginative, exciting, interesting, funny sort of way. And it's great fun when you have the confidence to start looking for these things and find them for yourself. That gives you enormous self-confidence, and I think that's really important too. You have to believe that, in where you want to go. And I would just urge people that, you may see now the job that you eventually want to do, and it may not be at all obvious how you're going to get there. But if you keep doing things that interest you and adding to the skills, to the experience that you've got, then that's the way to eventually get to where you want to go.
On page 186 of the Lecky Scotland Higher Biology student book, you will find the biodiversity key area and a list of what you should already know from National 5 and BGE biology. Biodiversity is important for sources of food, economic value and the stability of ecosystems. I went on to ask Doug about his favourite habitat and the species that live there. And of course, you can go to some properly amazing places. You've obviously been a lot of places. What's your favourite habitat on the planet and why?
It's really difficult. I mean, the Antarctic will always have a special place in my heart because I spent a long time down there. Even before I started filming, I made some great friends. The lifestyle on base was just suited me down to the ground when I was there. So the Antarctic will always be special. And then equally, going to the Arctic, the North Pole, that was remarkable because I could take a lot of the experience that I had gained in the Antarctic and transfer it up to the Arctic. But the two are very different. The Arctic, you've got the native people up there, you've got polar bears. No polar bears in the Antarctic, but lots of polar bears in the Arctic. And a
polar bear is one of your favourites.
I was going to say polar bears are probably my favourite animal, and that's partly because of the privilege that I've had of spending so much time with them. They don't give up their secrets easily. A lot of the time they do nothing. They might be asleep or they might be just simply walking. And so when you get a chance to watch them hunting and all the different ways they have of hunting, when you've waited 6 weeks for the female to come out of the den and then finally she does with 2 cubs, it's just massively exciting. So
what makes them so special? What makes them stand out?
Polar bears are sexy, charismatic, clever, and they'll eat you. That's what I think is the key difference between polar bears and any other bear. In fact, polar bears and a lot of other animals. I mean, lions eat people, buffaloes charge people, crocodiles take a lot of people. But there's none of those are quite as clever, I don't think, or quite as definite about the fact that they will go after human beings. Polar bears regularly, sadly, eat human beings. There are human beings in the summer who get eaten by polar bears every year. And now that polar bear, it's not like it's particularly attacking humans. It's not like, a lion. There's these stories in the past of man-eating lions, but those are very much the exception. Whereas a polar bear, when you're up in the Arctic, and you're out there on the summer in the tundra or out in the sea ice, then you simply smell to a polar bear like another potential meal. And they're very clever. They can creep up on seals and catch them, seals that are super wary. So they've got lots of ways.
Of course, you yourself have almost been served up for dinner to a polar bear, is that correct?
Well, I've had them pretty close. Well, I have had them very close. I mean, when you go out filming, it's almost not a matter of if you'll have a close encounter, but sooner or later you will. But we always carry, the means to chase the polar bear away. We carry guns that fire explosive cracker shells. Have a stuff called bear spray, which is it's kind of like hairspray, but it's basically a pepper spray. And as long as the polar bear is downwind and not too far away, but not too close, then you can give him a squish of bear spray, and if that hits his nose or eyes, then he'll get sent away. But you have to be aware every time that you're out on the sea ice, you are in a polar bear's habitat, and if you're not careful, they will creep up on you, and suddenly they're there, and they can be very dangerous. It's interesting when you work with the Inuit. the native people up there. I remember one of the early polar bears that I saw, and I was very excited, and I was filming it. The camera was on the tripod, and I was, getting some nice shots of it. And I noticed my Inuit guide, Andrew, who was with me. He wasn't interested in this bear. And I saw him looking around, and I said, Andrew, this is a great bear we've got in front of us. He's doing some really interesting things. And Andrew just said, but you must remember, Doug, it's not the polar bear you can see that's going to get you. And he was looking around for possibly another one coming over another piece of ice that I would have been much too engrossed in the one I could see, to see the one who might be much more dangerous coming up behind me.
Of course, it is humans, not polar bears, who are the biggest threat to biodiversity. Threats to biodiversity include habitat loss, exploitation, the bottleneck effect, and introduced, naturalised and invasive species.
That's the sad thing, really, that the longer you've been in this business, the more you will notice degraded habitats. The classic one is just, the oceans, for example, particularly the southern oceans. I cannot imagine what it was like to go to the Antarctic 120 years ago, 110 years ago, because there were so many whales down there. There was recently a thing on the news about a blue whale being seen, or the number of blue whales off South Georgia seemed to be increasing. And they were talking about numbers of a few dozen that had been seen off South G recently. Well, when you look at the figures in that sector of the Antarctic that stretches from South Georgia to the peninsula, over the 12 years between 1920 and 1932-33, they hunted 218,000 blue whales in that area.
Brutal.
And you look at other parts of the world where, off the Nova Scotian coast, for example, other places, you realise that there were places that you just couldn't have gone without seeing blows of whales coming up all over the place. And sadly, the same can almost be said for sharks and things like that. Sharks have taken a terrible battering in the last years, partly as bycatch, getting caught up in fishing nets, and partly because they have been targeted for things like shark fin soup and for other so-called medicinal purposes, particularly in the Far East or so. And to be honest, there are.
Those are just really, really strong examples of overexploitation. Exploitation of a species happening at a rate which means it basically can't be replaced by natural means, and that is as a direct consequence of human activity in a lot of cases.
And sometimes it has a double spin-off. You've got these lovely animals called sea otters that you find off the west coast of America, off the Californian coast and stretching all the way up to Alaska. And those things were, again, really hammered by the fur traders who found them. They got very, very fine fur. And they were hunted almost to extinction through the 1800s or so. But what happened was that they took out, what they didn't realise was that the sea otters were really important predators on the sea urchins that lived down on the seabed. And when they took all the sea urchins out, when they took all the sea otters out, there was a population explosion with the number of urchins on the bottom. And the kelp forest, which is this fantastic habitat off there with the big, tall, 10, 12 metre long fronds of kelp that come out and come all the way to the top and are a really important part of the ecosystem. Well, because there were an explosion of urchins, they were overgrazing the kelp forest. So the kelp forest started to disappear. So there you had a direct line between human beings taking out the number of sea otters, affecting the number of urchins, which led to the almost collapse in areas of the kelp forest. So nature's all wonderfully interconnected, and what we see now as we go around is the culmination of a lot of evolution which has happened over the years, and often exists as this sort of climax environment the result of many, many years of evolution, competition between animals and things like that. And when we start messing around with one of the components in that ecosystem, then it can often have indirect consequences that we can't imagine when we start, or we never thought about it when we start. I'd like to think now that we're much more aware of this overall ecosystem, but there are still examples of us mistreating environments, all around the world.
As part of the higher course, we'll look at the impact on species richness as a result of habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. I guess with the impact of humans, you start to see sort of bottleneck effects, particularly in small populations that start to lose genetic variation that's needed to enable evolutionary responses to the sort of changes in the environment. Obviously, some of these species kind of have naturally low genetic diversity, but still remain viable. Narwhals, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to mention narwhal. There's about something like, they reckon about 120,000 something narwhal living up in the Arctic. But when you take DNA samples from them, there's a very restricted amount of genetic variation in them. And the suggestion is that about 110,000 years ago, when the last glacial period happened, then maybe that created this ideal habitat in which narwhals, maybe the population was much lower at that point, but with the coming of the Ice Age, suddenly the habitat became better for them, and they might have rapidly, the numbers in that population might have grown rapidly. So, but because it was small to start with, there wasn't much genetic variability there. But there is concern that with the Arctic changing the way it is, that their low genetic diversity will in the end, be their undoing. But on the other hand, you can look and say, well, they've been around for a long time and they're still managing okay. But yeah, no, it's
120,000, of course, isn't a huge number. And the narwhals are quite social animals, they're quite a social species. Do they sort of show sort of social hierarchy? And
I think they do. Narwhals are definitely, they're intriguing. They're hard to study, but they do have this behaviour that you'll sometimes see. You're out there up in the Arctic and you're looking out across the flat water, because it's good to have a nice calm night. And in the distance, you'll see this, it just looks like a spear going up out of the water. And this spear comes up, maybe 3 meters long. That will come up, and then another one appears beside it. And these spears will cross over, and then one of them might dip down, and the other one will lay the spear, or one spear will be laid across the other and given a bit of a tap. And this is a group of narwhal, 2, maybe more, and they're in the water doing something. And we don't really know, to be honest, what we're doing, because they're super wary and they're hard to get close to. But it is something that I think drones, for example, could be used, because with a drone, you can get right over the top and you can look down and you can see what's going on within the group of narwhals underneath. There are some people who think that it's possibly, this is what you see when a group of males are trying to mate with a female. The female doesn't usually have a tusk. But when the males get around, it may be that 2 or 3 of them kind of cooperate or try to get breeding with the female, and just in adopting a position where they might start breeding, that's when the tusks come up above the water. But at the same time, there is this idea that the narwhal tusk is what they call a secondary sexual characteristic. So if you've got a longer tusk than another male, then you show off to them, and that can convince the other male that you're somehow more powerful than them. And so you don't fight with each other, you just show the tusks, and then, the one leaves, and that leaves the other one to get busy with the female. So they are very sociable. I mean, they're toothed whales, so they're related to dolphins. And dolphins are among the most intelligent, the most socially developed of all the whales. I mean, we see some remarkable things amongst populations of dolphins, which have been studied for a long time. Places like Monkey Mia, for example, in Australia, that's a big, huge bay, and people have been studying the dolphins in Monkey Mia for many, many years, 20, 30 years. And because it's shallow and because the dolphins are kind of accustomed to boats, it means that scientists can stick with these dolphins for hours at a time, every day for months at a time. And so they know who's mating with who, they know the relationships between the pods, and some of the behaviours that they see, the rivalry between the pods, the sort of cleverness that they use, not just with feeding techniques, but kind of interacting socially. It just has proved conclusively that there's a really complicated, sophisticated, intergenerational, intersexual, social hierarchy between them, which is as complicated as any human family. There's jealousy being shown, there's a bit of aggression, there's special friends that they've got, there's friends you can rely on to pay you back favours, and all this sort of stuff goes on at the dolphin level.
We will learn more about social behaviour in another key area, but I was interested in exploring further how drones can be used in science, particularly when it comes to learning more about whales.
So my name's Eadin. I'm an Irish-German scientist in training. I work with an NGO called the North Coast Cetacean Society, or BC Wales for short, doing my master's bioresearch with the University of St Andrews in Scotland. So a little bit all over the map at the moment, but the NGO that I work with, BC Wales, we're based in the northern parts of British Columbia and Canada. And the main focus is to research the whale populations using that coastline.
Which I guess in simple terms basically means that you're using drones to look at whale snot?
Yeah, so essentially the purpose is to collect the whale blow. So as the whale comes up and it exhales, you essentially have these droplets of whale snot or blow coming into the air. So we're using drones to swoop in and collect a sample of that, because that is just contains so much information, biological information about these whales. So we're trying to figure out how we can use that snot to do more science.
That sounds pretty cool. So it can't be very easy though to fly a drone above a whale in the ocean and capture snot. How does that process work?
So we use a pretty small drone to try and keep it as non-invasive as possible. So we want to have a minimal impact on these whales. And essentially, the way that it works is that you're piloting, or let's say I was piloting the drone. The drone I can see what the drone sees in real time. So I'm flying it as if I'm looking with the drone. And essentially, you have to have, I guess, an understanding of how to time the whale coming up for a breath, and then it disappears, and then it comes up for another breath. So you're basically just trying to have preempt the breath and have your drone in the right position to then swoop in and fly through the breath as it happens. Essentially, the drone has little petri dishes attached to it, which is how we store that snot afterwards. So once you collect your sample, then you bring that drone back to either land, if we're flying from land, or else to the research vessel, and then catching the drone out of the air, which is a whole other challenge, and putting the snot on ice is the next step.
Nice. And that must take a fair bit of practice then, I guess, before you manage to get it right.
Yeah. So the field season for me last year, I spent 6 months out in BC, and that was spent just trying to, hone those skills, the piloting skills, the whole field method itself, because it's a relatively new process. Whale blow is just, being slowly being discovered as a source that can be collected with drones, because it's such an exploding tool, I guess, in the field of conservation biology.
And why would somebody want to collect the blow? Why would you want to have a look at that?
A whole host of different reasons. So my main purpose for this, so it's humpback blow that we're working on, and my focus is genetics, because you can get, essentially there's epithelial cells. So from the inside of the lungs, you're getting cells into that snot sample, which you can use to extract and then sequence your DNA. But there's a whole host of other things you can do with a snot sample. So there's teams around the world that are looking at the viruses, the bacteria within there, trying to get an idea of health, using it as a health check. Or, for example, looking at the hormone content in the blow. So can we detect pregnancy from a snot sample, or are we able to figure out if they're stressed or not? Looking at cortisol, one of those stress hormones. So there is honestly a range of different things you can do with whale snot.
One of the things that I believe you did while you were out looking at the whales was you were also able to look at their body size using LiDAR lasers. A lot of our students will be doing things like, we'll be studying higher maths, and will maybe be wondering if they'll ever use trigonometry again. Am I right in thinking there might be a bit of trigonometry in measuring the size of the whale with a drone?
Yeah, it was a bit of an aha moment for me as well when I, started working with this, because I was asking myself the exact same thing in school. Was, sometimes you go, what is the point? Like, is there any real life application at all? And then all of a sudden I'm, part of this project where that's one of the key ways of measuring the body size of whales, of living, swimming, breathing whales. So essentially what we've done is we've attached this LiDAR laser, as you said, which is a pulsing laser beam to the base of the drone. And then by flying over and simultaneously recording video footage of these whales, you essentially then can use the LiDAR data, which basically consists of a really accurate measurement of height over the surface of the sea. So you have video footage with the image of the whole whale's body, and then overlaid that with very accurate height of the LiDAR device, or the drone, because they're all attached to each other, over the whale. And then essentially what you can do is you can use a right angle triangle in order to then calculate essentially what you're doing is calculating the size of a pixel in an image, and then using that to then figure out what the overall body size is of that whale. So you're able to look at it, the body length, the width, and then from there you're able to start looking at things like body volume, and then ideally down the line looking at things like nutritional status. So are these whales fat and healthy? Are they malnourished? Are they pregnant? Those are the types of biological questions that then come out of some quite clever trigonometry.
And we, of course, we actually met for the first time deep in the Amazon rainforest when you were actually working in the field there. And from memory, you were using trigonometry as well to calculate the height of trees.
Yeah, so I was working with Operation Wallacea, or Opwall, out there with the Sani Isla, who are a very small Quechua community living on the banks of the Napo River. And my job was the vegetation scientist on the team. So one of the overarching goals of our team out there was biodiversity assessment. So we were looking at the variety of species that belong to the Sani territory, the traditional territory of this community. So the way we were using trigonometry for the botanical part of the studies was looking at the tree heights. So by basically calculating the angle up to the top of the tree, you're able to then again use trigonometry to calculate the height of that tree. And from there, you're then able to calculate the size of the crown of the tree. And then again, upscaling that, you're then able to start looking at the biomass of the tree and therefore the carbon uptake of that tree. So then you're starting to talk about things like climate change and how forests are called carbon sinks because they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, actively fighting against anthropogenic human-caused climate change. So that's what we were doing out there. That's how we're using trigonometry, as well as working very closely with the Sani to map, like I said, the biodiversity. So looking at the different tree species and their importance from a human perspective, as well as from a biological perspective.
The three measurable components of biodiversity are genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity comprises the genetic variation represented by the number and frequency of alleles in a population, while species diversity, which can be split into species richness or relative abundance, is important because a high number of species results in a stable ecosystem. If one species dominates or there's a high abundance of them, then species diversity can be reduced. Ecosystem diversity, however, is the number of distinct ecosystems within a defined area, and a region with a wide variety of ecosystems will generally have a greater species diversity. We'll hear more from Eadin in future lessons. In the meantime, let's go back to Doug and hear a little bit more about his experiences and sadly some of the habitat destruction he's witnessed.
Well, I went to Madagascar early on in my career. I went there in 1990 and was there for 6 months. We had a Land Rover and we drove more or less the length of Madagascar.
It's
and
a
we
tough
were
job you've got, Doug.
we were making part of a film, part of a 2-part series about Madagascar. And it was it was tough even back in those days. You could go and there was a lot of practicing of slash and burn agriculture, which is really where you go into an area of forest, you chop it down, and then you burn the remains of what's left with it, and you probably
Why would somebody want to do that?
Well, partly because they're so poor. They're so poor, and there's no control of it. But it is a way for a farmer, a subsistence farmer, to clear enough land that him and his family can live for maybe a couple of years off that piece of exposed ground, and then they move on to the next bit. The challenge being that habitat does not grow back very quickly, and if you do it over large areas, and then come the rainy season, then you get very big erosion. There are large areas of Madagascar which just wash away every year. There's an enormous amount of soil gets carried down the rivers and into the seas and stuff like that. And there, of course, it can have an effect on the coral reefs or the offshore ecosystems. So much sediment coming in can just suffocate whatever's living there. And of course, Madagascar has got probably a higher percentage of animals in Madagascar do not live anywhere else. Madagascar is separated from Africa hundreds of millions of years ago. And so that's why you have these unique species like, lemurs and other animals, and an enormous number of plants which grow in Madagascar and nowhere else. There's a whole area down in the south called the spiny forest where almost every plant is found nowhere else apart from Madagascar. There's no monkeys, stuff like that in Madagascar. So it's a really important place for unique biodiversity. And the sad thing is that about having made that film in 1990 and made all those points, I remember reading an article in one of the Sunday newspapers about 3 years ago pointing out the problems in Madagascar. And as far as I could see from reading it, almost nothing had happened for the better. The areas of wildlife were smaller. They might have been still connected by these corridors, but, there's no doubt that wildlife was still under an extreme amount of pressure, and the people weren't much better off than they had been all those years ago. And, we really need the developed world to start looking after these wild places in a responsible way and to think about the best ways to look after them and channel the resources, towards them. But now, sadly, Madagascar is one example. But as I say, coral reefs are coming under pressure from, overfishing them, from climate change, acidification of the oceans, because the oceans are becoming more acid. As the amount of CO2 in the air becomes greater, then more CO2 dissolves into the ocean, and that makes the sea more acidic. And more acid seas just dissolve coral. So the coral's having a much harder job to grow and to do well in these more acidic seas.
And that habitat degradation, that then just causes obviously an increase in the competition between species within those smaller kind of fragments that continue to exist. And ultimately that just leads to a decrease in biodiversity.
Yeah, any animal needs a certain amount of space, to live in. Elephants need quite a large space because they do a lot of grazing and things like that. But on a coral reef, for example, on a fully developed, unexploited, unimpacted coral reef, there are an incredible number of fish species, hundreds within a square kilometre. But all those fish will have evolved to live in their own little, what we call niche, in their own little special bit of environment. Some of them, might be two that feed on algae growing on the rocks, but one fish will have a long snout on it, almost like an elephant. And that one has evolved that way to feed on the algae that grows in the cracks, which the other one with a normal mouth can't get into. So when you start spoiling a reef, taking away the coral, taking away all the possible food, or taking out certain fish so that the competition between fish, so that balance changes, then you can change the whole balance of the ecosystem. And of course, if you destroy the basic thing, you bleach the coral or you chop down all the trees in the forest, then you're just left with nothing, nowhere for the animals to live, and you end up with a very impoverished ecosystem.
That's when we bring into the discussion habitat corridors, to stop that widespread fragmentation and to reduce the number of fragments that become isolated.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was, driving back from the shops the other day, and I was driving along and I looked at the car and there was a lovely long piece of grass verge that was just full of wildflowers. And I suddenly remembered that I had read that grass verges at the sides of the road are really important wildlife corridors as far as UK is concerned, because they link up fields and they give animals, they allow the animals to move from one part, maybe a pond somewhere, to somewhere else that's suitable along the side of a busy road. If you, were to look at a grass verge, you'd probably see lots of burrows with mice and little things, rabbits and all that, using it. And there's a movement now to try to persuade councils to cut the verges less often. Save money, but also if you cut the verges too often, then you just cut down all the plants, at crucial times. So,
funnily enough, we spoke with Dave Goulson in our first introductory lesson, and one of Dave's messages was to cut our lawns less in the UK and get away from this idea of a kind of Wimbledon style garden lawn, and it's very much the same, the same for grass verges.
I think
and there's a huge amount of biodiversity in these little pieces of the UK.
Yeah. Anyone who's got a garden should think about leaving a fifth of its area just wild. Put some logs down, make sure you water it. Don't let the plants go wild in that bit, because that is big enough for to be a little wildlife haven for all kinds of stuff. And the bigger you can make it, the more likely you are to get stuff. But just a pile of logs, put down big logs, let them rot, not long before you notice the blue tits, the robins getting in there and, pecking away at things. So wildlife corridors are really interesting.
Doug went on to discuss the difference between naturalised and invasive species and give us a further insight into the parts of the world he's been privileged to explore.
There was a lovely definition that I got, because I was reading up a little bit in preparatory to this, and I was reading about...
Good to see you've done your homework, Doug.
Exactly. Invasive and naturalised and this kind of thing. And there was a good little sort of quote that pulls it together, is that naturalised plants are ones which have come in but stay in a bit of balance. They've been introduced, but they stay in a balance with the new habitat in which they've been introduced. On the other hand, invasive species, that's an organism that causes effectively ecological harm in a new environment where it wasn't native in the first place. So invasive species, they can cause extinction of native plants and animals. They can reduce the diversity by competing with the native animals and plants for limited resources. And, you don't need to look very far to see that. I mean, if you take rats are probably the most invasively successful species worldwide that has ever existed. If you're ever down the docks, have a look at ships that are tied up. And even today, when you look at the ropes that are tying the ship up onto the harbour, quite often when you go up, follow your eye up the rope, and you'll see there's a circle of metal on that rope. And that is to stop the rats running up the ropes and getting into the ship and carried somewhere else. And rats are pretty much everywhere. it's interesting. They got on to South Georgia, this fantastic island down in the South Atlantic. Now, South Georgia was pretty much unexplored, undiscovered, until they discovered whales down there. And the Norwegians decided, they were a big whaling company, the Norwegians decided that South Georgia would be a great place to have a whaling station. So they built 3 whaling stations on South Georgia. And they inadvertently introduced rats onto South Georgia. They didn't mean to introduce the rats, but another species, reindeer, they introduced the reindeer because they felt like some fresh meat. So they brought all that along, and they kind of managed okay until climate change came along. And when climate change came along to South Georgia, then the summers became warmer and the rats really started to explode. And that was a big problem for the ground nesting birds, because the birds, remember, down there, they've got no predators, there are no polar bears, stuff like that. So a lot of the birds can just breed on the ground. It's not a problem. But that made them a real target for the rats. The other problem, however, was that the rats had been sort of constrained by the glaciers. There are areas where the snow melts in South Georgia in the summer, but there were always these permanent glaciers on each side of the bays, and the rats wouldn't cross the glaciers, neither were the reindeers. So the rats and reindeers existed. They didn't have to be, they weren't fed or anything like that, but they were existing, but they were constrained by the geography around about them. But as climate change came and the glaciers started to melt, the reindeer started to move out further, and so did the rats. So they decided, about 10 years ago or so, they decided on a rat eradication program, which was very ambitious, but by dropping poisoned bait down from helicopters during the summer and things, poison that was specific against rats, they managed to eliminate the rats on South Georgia. It was expensive. I think it was several tens of millions of pounds, and it took about 7 or 8 years to do it properly. And then they decided with the reindeer, which were also trampling some of the ground nesting birds, but more importantly were destroying the moss ecosystem and lichen ecosystem that was down there. Again, about 7 or 8 years ago, they took all the reindeer off. They chased them all down to the shore, either shot them and took the meat to the Falklands, or there was a small number who were taken to the Falklands to be introduced on an island there and to be allowed to reproduce and things. So those were 2 invasive. Well, the rat was invasive, the reindeer was introduced, but ultimately they caused a hell of a lot of damage on South Georgia and had to be taken out.
It can be incredibly difficult to get rid of these invasive species, as you said there. And you obviously mentioned we took a group of pupils to Galapagos a couple of years ago, which you helped us with.
Yeah.
And there's one of the sort of fascinating stories that springs to mind in Galapagos was quite similar, and it was to do with people putting goats on some of the islands. Mm-hmm. And again, these animals were put there for meat purposes, because they were, to feed sailors or other locals. Yep. And they had a fascinating way of getting rid of the goats in the end. So I think they set up a system which involved Judas goats, and because of the way that the social groups within goats work, they would put a tracker on certain goats, and follow that goat, but that goat would obviously attract other goats who would walk, and a helicopter would come past, and as that helicopter would come past, the goats would be picked off one by one by a sniper in the helicopter. But they would always leave the Judas goat, because the Judas goat would go away again, meet up with other goats.
Oh yeah, okay.
A week later, they would come back and bang, they would take out some more goats. But it was an ongoing, it was difficult, it was expensive. Yeah. To some degree with goats it's much easier. And it's not just animals, of course. We've got huge problems with invasive plants.
Well, you've got the rhododendron. The rhododendron's a pretty common plant in Glasgow parks. That was introduced. That's got nothing to do with UK. That was brought over from India and Nepal.
David Attenborough once said, "The world is full of wonders, but they become more wonderful, not less wonderful, when science looks at them. With that in mind, we'll hear more from both Doug and Eadin in future episodes. And in our next lesson, we'll follow in the footsteps of Phileas Fogg as we take a journey around the world with Jonathan Drury and Mark Beaumont. For now though, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Doug for giving us all a glimpse of the wonders of our living world through our television screens. People like yourself, Doug, and Sir David Attenborough have been able to bring those places and bring those animals and to our television screens and make that such a huge part of our life. And I'm sure on behalf of everyone that's ever seen those programmes, I can extend a huge amount of thanks and gratitude. So thank you so much for giving your time and speaking to us and speaking to all the students and possibly teachers that are listening to this. It's hugely appreciated. Thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure, Dave. My pleasure, Paul.
If I get the same kudos as Sir David Attenborough for this podcast, I'll be pretty happy, to be honest.
No, it's great. I think it's great what you're doing.
You can find what you need to know on biodiversity within your class notes, or on pages 80 to 84 of the Lecky Scotland Revision and Practice 2 books in 1. You can get 40% off all Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers using the discount code LeckyPodcast40 online at www.leckyscotland.co.uk.